You can all go ahead and grab a seat.
Well, hey, everybody, good morning to you. I'm really glad you're here today. You did not let the looming snow dissuade you from showing up like so many of those lollygaggers out there. So thanks for being here today. We're going to talk about something really important for us all to figure out and sort through. We're going to look at a particular psalm today, two psalms really from the Bible. And if you were here last week, Joe Wilson, he talked about Psalm 1 from the Bible. Today, we want to look at Psalm 42 and a little bit of Psalm 43 as well, because these Psalms, they talk about a condition that can come upon you if you're on any sort of spiritual journey at all. And this condition, if we don't know how to deal with it, it can really derail us. It can throw us off a little bit. And so we got to become skilled at dealing with this condition. And these Psalms, they talk about this condition and they talk about how to deal with this condition. So if you have a Bible in one way, shape, or form, open it up to Psalm 42. And the very first verse of Psalm 42 gives this condition in metaphorical form. And then verse 2 sort of explains the metaphor. And so Psalm 42 verse 1 says it like this: "As the deer pants for streams of water." So, a panting deer looking for water. I don't know about you, but I have a ton of deer that seem to hang out in my yard. It's like my yard is their clubhouse or something. And so I go outside, I take the dog outside, there's some deer. I go to get the mail, it seems like there's some deer. I go to shovel the driveway of snow, there are the deer. It's like they're just hanging out all the time. In fact, we opened up our bedroom window one morning a few months back, and we counted them, there were 22 deer right outside our bedroom window. It was like a deer convention or something. Another morning, a couple months back, we opened up our window, and this is what we had right outside our window, right here. We got a picture. I know. We got those little bird feeders there. And it's like, he was like, "Hey, fellas, come on over to the Robinson yard. They put some bird feeders out for us, and we have some of this delicious Robinson grass that's here." It's almost like they know I'm not a hunter. I know some of you are hunters. Actually, you're not really a hunter. A hunter, calling yourself a hunter implies that you're actually shooting something and killing something. Most of you don't do that. I mean, you like to think that you do. You actually just go out into the woods and you look. You sit and you look. So you're not a hunter, you're a looker. Yeah. You're taking your weapon for a walk in the woods. That's what you're doing. But, when I see these deer in my yard that are hanging out there, they're not panting at all. They're very, very comfortable. In fact, one of the reasons I think they're kind of hanging out, in and around our house, is because we have this stream that's behind our house, that runs behind our house down the hill. We can actually see it, in the winter right now with the trees thinned out and such. And so none of the deer that are hanging around there are panting, because we got to understand, a panting deer, it's not just a deer that's looking for a drink of water, it's a little thirsty. A panting deer is literally a deer that's dying of thirst. And therefore, a panting deer is a deer that's come down to the riverbed or the stream or the water there in order to quench their thirst, only to find that the riverbed is dry. And you see, the psalmist is saying, I'm like the deer, and God is like the dry riverbed. That's the condition being described. And verse 2 explains it. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. Like the psalmist can't sense God, that personal sense that there's a God that's there, who I'm dealing with, and he's dealing with me. That give and take, it's gone, it's missing. I'm thirsty. And over again, in these first few verses, he says something similar, like when he says, where can I go and meet with God? When can I meet with God? Now, this doesn't mean that he's lost his belief in God. It means he's lost his relational experience of God's presence. Thoughts that used to comfort him or strengthen him or bolster him, they don't resonate anymore. They don't do it for him. They don't strike him anymore. He's lost that sense of God's presence in his heart and in his soul. He no longer feels he's got a hold on God, no longer has a sense that there's a God who he's in a personal relationship with. He's experiencing spiritual dryness and spiritual deadness and spiritual darkness and spiritual drought. And what's important to note and notice is that there are other psalms in which the spiritual dryness and deadness coexist with a sense of guilt. Like there are a number of psalms where the reason why the psalmist has lost the sense of God's reality in his life is because the psalmist has done something wrong. And therefore the psalmist feels guilt and needs to confess or needs to repent. But notice in Psalm 42 and 43, that's not happening. This psalmist, this writer, is experiencing a deep spiritual drought, and he's done nothing wrong. It's just come upon him. And this is crucial for us because in our culture, like a lot of times we have this approach that if something's wrong, like generally in our culture, we want to know who's to blame so that we can point the finger, or we can actually sue them. We are a litigating society, And so we believe nothing should be wrong, and if something's wrong, then somebody's to blame or somebody is to sue. And we carry that into faith. And so if something is off, if something is wrong, if I start to experience spiritual drought or dryness or deadness, then we say, well, I'm sure there's some button I'm not pushing. I'm sure there's something on my Christian to-do list that I'm missing. Or we say, I need something new. We say, I need a new ministry or I need a new church. Most often what we do is we switch churches. And unfortunately, we tend to be very moralistic about this too. And one of the reasons why it can be tough for Christians overall to admit to their Christian friends just how deeply, dry they might be is because there's this possibility that their Christian friends might react by saying something along the lines of like, what? You're not experiencing the reality of God in your life? You're not sensing his presence in your life? Well, have you prayed enough? Have you confessed all your sin? Have you counted all your blessings? Surely there would be nothing wrong if you're just doing, the typical Christian things. But this guy's, he's not doing anything wrong. And yet he's dying of spiritual thirst. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because I want us to understand this condition will come upon you. It simply will. It will happen to you and me. It will come. And of course, spiritual dryness and deadness can happen to you as a result of you doing something wrong. But the point is, it can happen without that. You and I, we will face this, even if we're doing all of the Christian things. Now, let me point this out. If you're a newer Christian, and one of the great joys of CCC is there are always people who are new to faith and church and God and a relationship with Jesus Christ. There are always people who are new around CCC. And if you're a newer Christian, this can be extremely tricky because the first time you experience this, it can freak you out. In part because, nobody tells you about it. Nobody tells you it's going to happen. And what happens is as a Christian, a new Christian, you can start to doubt the whole thing was real. You can start to think, well, it's just more of a dream than anything else. There's nothing really to it. And so it's important to understand that this is coming, and it's important for all of us to figure out how to deal with it. Now, something that tends to accentuate this is sometimes it's associated with this condition of spiritual drought. There are several things that are actually talked about in the psalm that aggravate this idea of spiritual drought. I just want to think about one for a minute. I want to point out one that's mentioned here, and it has to do with a lack of community, an interruption of relationship and community. You'll notice verse 4, how I used to go to the house of God under the protection of the Mighty One with shouts of joy and praise among the festive throng. And then a couple verses down, verse 6, My soul is downcast within me. Therefore, I will remember you from the land of the Jordan, the heights of Hermon, from Mount Mizar. Now, we got to understand what's going on here, in verse 4 and 6. Little geography we got to understand. And we don't know why this has happened, but he used to be in the southern part of what's called Judah, which is where the temple was, where the place of worship was. And he used to be in the southern part there in Judah and be a regular part of temple worship and part of the feasting and joy and praise. That's what the whole festive, throng thing is all about. But in verse 6, he's in the northern part. He's away from the people. He's away from the feasting. He's away from the temple. He's away from the worship. He's up in the north on the mountain range of which Mount Hermon is the peak. And we don't know why he's there. Like, we don't know if he's moved there or he's exiled there or he's captured there and carried off somehow. We don't know why. But here's the point. There's individual Bible study, and then there's corporate Bible study. There's individual prayer, and then there's corporate, collective prayer. And they are not the same thing. And you and I need them both. For example, he longs for and remembers fondly the festive throng. Literally, that means pilgrim feast. That can be translated pilgrim feast. What exactly is that, a pilgrim feast? Well, it's something very similar to what we're doing here at 8009 Corporate Drive. See, the feasts were times when the people of God corporately, collectively remembered the great and mighty acts of God. They remembered the wonderful things that God did in order to make them a people. Like the Passover was one of those feasts. People came from all over and they read the biblical sections about the great things God did to make them a people, the Exodus and all of that. And then they recommit themselves to God and they worship God together. You see, it's group Bible study and it's group prayer and it's group worship. And we, in our culture in particular, we are hyper-individualistic. As Americans specifically, we are hyper-individualistic, and we downplay the importance of community, of the communal spiritual disciplines. Over and over again, surveys show that 85 to 90% of Americans say, hey, I can be a good Christian. I can be a good spiritual person without being a part of an institution, without being a part of a church, without being a part of an institutional church. I can be a very good spiritual person all by myself. Surveys say that, 85 to 90% every year, year after year. And of course, what's important to understand about that position, that perspective, and that stance is this. It's completely wrong. Like, that stance is totally antithetical to all of Christianity. I mean, there are some individual parts of being a Christian, but there are so many collective parts of it. It's to be experienced in community. It was Paul Tournier who said there are two things you cannot do alone. One is to be married, and the other is to be Christian. And he's right. Like, all by yourself. How do you know? How do you know you're right about anything? How do you stay hot? How do you stay fired up? By yourself. All by yourself, you'll just fasten to God in your own image. See, the writer here in Psalms doesn't underestimate it, but we tend to underestimate it. And as a result, we fall into spiritual dryness because we want to come as individuals. We want to say, I can do this all by myself, A lot of us say, I'll just watch online. I'll just watch online. I'll watch a video. It's the same thing. It is completely different. It is not the same thing. It's not even close. A lot of us actually, we come in here and we still want to maintain our individuality, We want to come in here, we want to get our little fix, we want to get a sermon, we want to get some music, we want to maybe talk to one or two other acquaintances, talk about the weather or the Ravens, how they're going to whip up on the Bills later today, that kind of thing. And then we want to leave. We don't really want to make ourselves accountable. We don't really want to become a regular part of, a group study, regular prayer together. We don't want to make ourselves accessible. We don't want to do that. we're too busy, or we're too private. Listen, gang, we won't get away with it. It would lead to us thirsting. You know, another thing about this, I mean, you're here, right? You say, I'm not like all those, that riffraff staying at home, watching online because the snow that's going to come in the middle of the afternoon, hours from now. I'm not like all those people that say, I got to set out all the chips for tonight for a 6:30 game. Got to get ready. So I got to stay home today. Say, I'm here, Dave. I'm here. I mean, I go to CCC. Dave, I'm active. I'm involved. And let me just say, as somebody who's been a part of CCC from the start, people are constantly coming and going, coming and going, coming and going, coming and going. I probably have, somebody emails me, I'd say every month, or has a conversation with me, stops me in the lobby, gives me a call, text, whatever. And they say, Dave, I'm moving. Me and my family are moving. We, bought a house somewhere, or, got a new job somewhere, or I'm retiring or something like that. And so I'm wondering, is there a church like CCC in, wherever, Topeka, Kansas, or Allentown, Pennsylvania, or, hotter than Blue Blazes, Florida, or wherever, We're moving there. And if you're somebody who's here for any length of time, year after year after year, you're going to find that unless you are actively reconstructing your group, your people, your community, like every 2, 3, 4 years or so, well, you're going to find yourself at Mount Mazar wondering, where did everybody go? See, you're not going to fall into spiritual dryness because we lose our community. They're gone. People leave or people fall away, and we have to reconstruct and work on the new friendships. We have to work on who we're going to be accountable to and who we're going to be talking to about our spiritual journey and who we're going to be learning with and who we're going to be praying with and all that. Now, you may be saying, Dave, what are the cures to this condition, the spiritual dryness? And there are several things that the psalmist does here that we've got to do when this condition of spiritual dryness comes upon us. Several things that he does that we should notice. To start with, he pours out his soul. He says in verse 4 there, he says, these things I remember as I pour out my soul. Now, what he's doing here, and this is very ironic, this is the whole psalm and what he's pouring out his soul. He says, I don't feel God. I get nothing out of worship. I get nothing out of prayer. I just don't sense that he's there. And yet, what is Psalm 42 and 43? Well, this is an eloquently, theologically rich, sustained, reflective prayer. That's what Psalm 42 and Psalm 43 are. In other words, and this is the first thing that we got to do too, if you don't get anything out of worship during this dry time, don't miss it. If you get nothing out of prayer, don't stop it. If you get nothing out of reading the Bible, don't give it up. Pour out your soul. You say, I don't feel anything, Dave. Fine. Then talk to him about that. If nothing else, talk to God about how you're getting nothing out of talking to him. If nothing else, talk to God about how much you miss him. If nothing else, talk to the seemingly absent God about his absence. So the first thing you see is don't ignore these sort of spiritual disciplines. In fact, be more disciplined about them than you've ever been before. He pours out his soul. It's the whole psalm. And then you will also see this, that he analyzes his hopes. Now, there's this refrain. We see this through this refrain that comes up 3 times. And this refrain is somewhat the theme that runs through this whole section in verse 5, verse 11, verse 5 of Psalm 43. It's almost repetitious. And he says this, something along the lines of this. He says, why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God. 3 times he does that. He asks that question. And the commentators say he's looking for information. He's reflecting. He's probing. He's asking himself, why did I get so downcast? How did I get here? See? I hesitate to give this illustration. I really like this illustration, but I thought, I'm not so sure the illustration works. And so I was just going to cut it. But I think I want to use it for you all. I used it in the first service, and they were mean. So I want you to be kind. I'm just not sure, but we're going to try since we're all here together. Okay, you up for this? Okay, so here's what came to my mind. Why so downcast? He's reflecting, he's asking, he's probing. I was thinking about this character from Looney Tunes. Anybody remember Looney Tunes before? Anybody heard of Looney Tunes? Yes. You remember some of the characters from Looney Tunes? What are some of the characters? The Martian. Okay, the Martian. Yosemite Sam. The Tasmanian Devil. Bugs Bunny. Daffy Duck. Yeah, you're with me. Well, there's a very, very obscure character. His name is Charles M. Wolfe. One of the characters. He's only in a few episodes. Anybody ever heard of him before? Oh, just a couple of you have. And Charles M. Wolfe cracks me up, number one, all right? But I think he illustrates this too. Charles M. Wolfe, like one of the episodes, he's sitting there, he's watching a baseball game, just lounging in his chair, and his wife, Wolf, comes in. He's like, starts screaming at him. He's like, you got to get out there. You got to get something to eat. You got to hunt for something. You got to go get it. And he's like scrambling all around. He grabs his rifle and he's running. And as he's running, you know, he's going to hunt something. He's going to shoot something. Bugs Bunny comes running up beside him. And of course, Bugs Bunny says, what's up, Doc? Right? And he says, what are you hunting? And it stops him. He just stops dead in his tracks. He says, He's sort of a forgetful character. He goes, what was I hunting? Was it a squirrel? He says, no. Was it a porcupine? No. Was it a hippopotamus? No. He just goes through this until Bugs Bunny finally says, was it a rabbit? He's like, yeah, that's it, it's a rabbit. Right? And then he chases him around, whatever. And they just go through this cycle again. He's running around a tree at one point. He's like, I was chasing something around the tree, and he stops. And he's like, what was I chasing around the tree? Was it an antelope? No. And he's doing some self-reflection, okay? How's it going so far? So we got to do some Charles M. Wolfe. We got to do some self-examination. We got to ask ourselves, why so downcast? See, the psalmist here, he's looking for his hopes. He's examining, where were my hopes? He says, why am I so downcast? Well, it's because I put my hopes in some things that are now letting me down. Spiritual dryness is a perfect time to examine our hearts because spiritual dryness reveals false hopes. Like a perfect example of this is another psalm, Psalm 3, which is about when David, who wrote many of the Psalms, he's on the run for his life because his favorite son, Absalom, had actually pulled off a revolt. He had, a coup d'etat, and he had taken over David's throne and was now hunting David because he wanted to kill David so he could become the king. And there were two things that had been the source of David's glory, which is, a way of saying, David's significance. These things that David thought made him matter. Two things. And one was the love of his son and his family. And the other was the love and acclaim of his people. And he had lost them both at that point in time. And yet right in the middle of this psalm, Psalm 3, verse 3, David says, but you, O Lord, are my shield, my glory, and the lifter of my head, he says. He says all those other things, they were just cheap imitations. They were important, but they weren't the real thing. They're not you. They're not you. See, what David says is, my son used to be my glory. My people used to be my glory. And I've lost them, and it hurts me, but I'm not devastated because what I'm doing in this moment is I'm relocating my glory. I'm relocating my hopes in you and your grace and your love and your support and your approval. And if I've got that, then I won't be devastated by the loss of anything else. And so I will lift up my head anyway. And that's what's happening here in Psalm 42 and 43. He's saying one of the reasons I'm so downcast is because I've been putting my hopes in something else. And we don't know what the other things are. He doesn't tell us here. But they're just substitutes for you, God. And I'll tell you, in times of dryness, it's just a great time to examine where we're putting our hopes. What are the things that we really, really rest in and think they bring us such significance? Don't rest in them so much. Adjust your expectations of those things. Relocate our hopes, shift our hopes. And that's what we see him doing. You know, another thing the psalmist does here in Psalm 42 and 43 is he remembers the loving kindness of God. You notice verse 6, my soul is downcast within me, therefore I will remember. And he's not just thinking about and remembering God in general, but in verse 8, by day the Lord directs his love. At night his song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. Now what he's done is he's turned this into a song. And this is not a psalm of David like Psalm 3 was. This is a psalm of one of the sons of Korah. Like elsewhere in the Bible, 1 Chronicles 6 tells us that the sons of Korah were professional musicians. They were like full-time artists. And you'll even notice if you read this, that this one is a string instrumentalist. Like at the end, he says, I'll pick up my harp again someday. And what he's doing is he's turning the grace of God into a song that he sings to himself even at night. And see, this is one of the most important aspects of gathering like this here and singing together. This is one of the most important things. When we come together, when we sing together, it's so crucial what we do when we gather on Sundays like this, because it reminds us of important things as we declare together in song. He remembers the loving kindness of God. Finally, after all this, he takes this and he has learned to preach to himself. He's learned to preach to his heart, talk to his heart. He learns to tell the truth to himself. Because you'll notice he's not talking to us here, and he's not talking to some other audience through this psalm. He's saying, why so downcast, O my soul? And this is key. Like we'll never learn to get out of spiritual dryness unless we learn to do this. Like he's listened to his heart, he's poured out his heart, and he's analyzed his hopes, and he's thought about the grace and love of God. But it's at this point that he stops listening to his heart and he starts talking to his heart. Like in times of spiritual dryness and discouragement, every morning you wake up, it's there. Your heart's talking to you. And it says, oh no, this is terrible, this is awful, this is terrible, oh no. And at some point you got to grab your heart and you got to say, listen, shut up and listen. Do you know when to do that? Do you know how to do that? See, we are conditioned by our culture to listen to our heart and value what comes out of our heart. And it becomes authoritative. We give inappropriate weight to what we're feeling in our heart. And what we got to do is we got to tell the truth to our heart. We got to stop listening to it and letting it have so much influence over us. And we have to take control. And we have to preach to it. We have to talk to it. We have to speak truth to it. Adam Hawkey, I've heard him talk about this example before where he describes the journey of your life. You're driving along in a car and you've got your emotions with you. They're a part of your life and they matter. They're on the journey with you and they really are happening. Whatever you're feeling inside, that's really happening to you and you value them. But what you can't do as you're journeying along is you can't let your feelings and your internal world, you can't let that take the wheel. They got to be in the passenger seat or, got to be in the back seat. Sometimes, if they're screaming at you, sometimes you got to put them in the trunk, You can't let them have their hands on the wheel. Because at some point you have to say, okay, now listen. You got to tell yourself what is really, really true. God, I don't know why this is happening. But what I know is that you work good for people who love you and are called according to your purpose. In all things you work good. God, I don't know why this situation is here, but I know I need to stay faithful to you because you're faithful to me. God, I don't understand why this is going on, but I know you care for me. And because of your goodness and your grace, you can handle this. I can handle this because you can handle this. You got to speak the truth to your heart. If you've listened to your heart and you've found its false hopes, at some point you have to turn around and you have to learn to preach the grace of God and the gospel of God to yourself. Do you know how to do that? And you take yourself in your hand and you say, you've forgotten this and you've forgotten that and you've forgotten this and you've forgotten that. It's absolutely an essential skill to tell yourself the truth. And you see the results of it all. Like, notice what he says here. Verse 5 of Psalm 43. He doesn't say, hope in God, I do now praise him. That'd be denial. And he doesn't say, hope in God, I'll never praise him. That'd be despair. He says, hope in God, I will yet praise him. He sets his course. He decides, this is the direction I'm headed. And if we look carefully, we'll see a progression that like bit by bit by bit, he starts in the dumps and he moves himself up by the end. One last thought. I don't know how he preached to his heart about the loving kindness of God and about the grace of God. But we've got a resource that he doesn't have. Like the biggest problem during times of dryness is we say, I think that God has finally given up on me. He's not here anymore. And it makes sense because, I'm just so foolish. I'm a failure. I'm inadequate. I've blown it again. He's abandoned me finally. He's left me. But the psalmist says, no, I will yet praise him. He's a loving, kind God. He's a gracious God. He will not abandon me. And the question is, how do we know? How do we know? Well, we get to read it with Jesus Christ in mind. We have a resource that he didn't have. We get to preach Jesus to ourselves. We get to remember Jesus and focus on Jesus and fix our eyes on Jesus. We get to remember that Jesus went all the way. When we were dead in our sin, he didn't give up on us. He didn't leave us. He actually leaned into us. And he went all the way to the cross and to the grave and back for us. He won't abandon us. He's the most stable thing in our life. Writer of Hebrews says, so we fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, sat down at the right hand of God the Father. So we fix our eyes on him so that we will not grow weary and lose heart. So let's fix our eyes on Jesus now. That's what we're going to do. We're going to take this little individually wrapped packet of communion. It has a little piece of bread, a little bit of juice, reminds us of what Jesus has done for us. He's gone all the way and back for us, you see. If you didn't get one of these individually wrapped packets, they're in the back at the near the doors on the tables back there. But let's take a few moments and let's remember Jesus. Let's focus on Jesus. Let's preach the gospel to ourselves. Let's speak the truth to ourselves. And let's remember Jesus Christ. Let's celebrate.